Elmore Leonard's 10 Rules of Writing. Now, Leonard was an American crime fiction writer who passed away a few years ago. He lived and wrote well into his 80s. He started with Westerns, actually, maybe in the 1960s. And it took a while for him to break through as a crime writer. And then when he did, he became very popular. He had a distinctive style. A lot of people tried to imitate it, but no one could quite do it. It was based on Hemingway in the beginning, but it had some humor, had some flair, and he tended to get you started right in the middle of the action, usually with some dialogue. He didn't worry about backstory. He didn't worry about heavy description. And he developed these rules. Probably somebody asked him one time, maybe a reporter or something, just what are your rules? And he came up with them. But there's a little bit of humor to them, but there's also some truth to these rules. They make you think. And so we're going to take a look at the Elmore Leonard 10 Rules of Writing. Okay. Okay, so Elmore Leonard's 10 Rules of Writing. And these are kind of fun. And he might have been even producing some of these tongue-in-cheek. But again, I've read almost everything he's written, and most of these rules do apply to his work. So I think on some level he does believe in this approach. And then a lot of this is what not to do here. So that's fine. Whatever you can cut back usually helps. Most writers try to do too much, honestly. And less is generally more in good quality fiction. But his first thing, kind of a funny one, but when you think about it, it applies to an awful lot of works of fiction. Never open a book with weather. The weather. You know, the day broke bright and clear, and Jim looked out the window and leaves were clinging to the window pane from the early fall, and the wind was in the distance, and you could see clouds on the horizon. You know, sometimes there's 3 or 4 weather conditions in the opening paragraph of a novel before anything happens. And to me, it's just clutter. I would agree with Leonard on that. Just start with the action. Get right into it. People don't care about the weather. And if the weather's important to the story, somebody's in a blizzard, you can work that in later on. But don't start off with the weather. Just as a side note, I'm on a couple of mailing lists of other genre fiction writers. And just kind of for my amusement, I'd like to see how they handle it. And they both, 2 specific ones I'm thinking of, they both start the mailing list sometimes with the weather. So not only are they probably starting their novels with the weather, but the mailing list to the readers. Yeah, one guy lives up north somewhere, it's cold. Yeah, we already have an early frost here today, and somebody else in Europe, the conditions are changing rapidly, and the orchards and this and that. They're doing the same thing, not only falling into the trap that Leonard says don't fall into, most likely in their books, but they're doing it in the newsletter. They think that's a good way, I guess, to kind of develop some rapport with the reader and bring you into their life a little bit. Start with the weather. Don't start with the weather. Start right with the action. Some kind of action. Doesn't have to be some guy killing somebody or jumping off a building or something, but start with something fairly dynamic. Somebody could just say something, but start with something meaningful. Second thing that sort of ties in, avoid prologues. Generally, there's no reason for a prologue. There's too much before any book starts. You have sometimes you have an introduction, then you have a dedication, then you have all the copyright information, this and that. And then you got a prologue, and then finally you got chapter 1. Just start with chapter 1. I've been guilty of prologues, but I think the one time I could justify it, I wrote a time travel series where kind of the inciting event for the whole series takes place in 1956, and the rest of the series is contemporary, 2017. And this one incident that takes place in 1956, I structured it as a prologue. That might be okay. But I think even then, thinking back, I probably didn't need to do that. Don't clutter up. Just boom, chapter 1 and get going. Never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. When you think about it, that happens a lot, especially in young fiction, young adult fiction, children's fiction. For some reason, the writers think that the reader is going to get bored if they have to keep reading said, when in actuality, said is the least intrusive way to say it. Readers block out said when you keep saying said. All they want to know is what the person actually said, what they did say. So said is the perfect way to structure that. You know, you don't have to say he grumbled, he gasped, he sneered, she begged, groaned, cautioned, lied, all these things. You can do those things in other parts of your story, but not to describe saying something. Just say said. I've seen, again, some of the genre writers where it's almost like they have a mental block. They can't say said. And not only that, they can't repeat the other word more than once. So they have to come up with several different ways to say said, often on the same page. If there's a lot of dialogue on one page, they'll actually do that multiple times on the same page with different words. And it's almost comical. To me, it's very amateurish, and I stopped reading pretty much right there, honestly. That's maybe just me, but you don't need to do that. You don't need to get fancy. Just say said. You're not a bad writer if you say said, and the intelligentsia will realize you're actually a good writer. Just say said. What goes along with that, don't use an adverb to modify the verb said. So the classic example they gave you, instead of saying, let's get out of here fast, John said, we better get out of here fast, John admonished gravely. Admonished, like he's lecturing somebody, and then gravely. Or he grumbled warily. Or it's too late, she gasped emphatically. You don't need that. Don't add on any words that have ly at the end. Those are almost all adverbs have ly at the end. Don't add those on to said. Keep your exclamation points under control. Not a problem with most people, but sometimes in genre fiction, young adult, the writer likes to make an emphatic point and keeps throwing in exclamation points once in a while. Then they stand out. Then it'll stand out. Maybe literally a couple times in the whole book, tops. And then they'll stand. If you do it more than that, you look bad. These are all my opinions, by the way. You do it however you want, but I like to, give you my opinion based on kind of what I feel, how I feel my style has developed over the years. Never use the word suddenly or all hell broke loose. Usually there's a different way to put it. That's kind of a cop-out. Suddenly, the train came to an abrupt stop. It sounds okay, but there's usually a better way to do that. Use regional dialects sparingly. So if somebody's from the South or somebody's from New York and they say words a certain way, or from Boston, once in a while, spell out the word they might say it. You probably get away with that. But if you get it in too deep, then you can't extricate yourself. Then you'll be stuck. And then you're committed. And then the whole line of dialogue, every time the person opens their mouth, has to be constructed that way. And you find yourself with funny hyphens in there and things like that. And you get out of control quickly. So be careful about that. If you just you mentioned somebody's from New York and he grew up in Brooklyn, people generally assume that the guy has a little edge to the way he speaks, and you don't have to spell it out every word. Maybe just an occasional word, though, to remind the reader. Avoid detailed descriptions of characters. You think you want to describe characters when you're writing a novel, but you don't. And I think you'll learn that. You don't want to overdo it. You're better off, again, from the reader's point of view. You don't want to bore the reader. That's another thing. But you're better off from the reader's point of view, the story's point of view, just the flow of the actions the flow of the action. You'd be better off actually having two people discuss something, and as they're talking, you develop a sense of their personalities, and from there you probably get a little sense of what they might look like, at least enough of a sense, and that's much more effective. What goes along with that, don't go into great detail describing places and things. Again, let the story unfold, and those items will essentially take care of themselves. And if you get to a point where you really need to describe something because it's critical to the story, then do so. But don't just arbitrarily start describing things because that's the way you think a writer should do it. Don't forget, now this is Elmore Leonard speaking from experience. I'm agreeing with most of these. Your mileage may vary. You do it however you want, but I think you're going to write a cleaner book, a more effective, cleaner book, less clutter. We're trying to keep the clutter out of your prose if you basically follow these rules. And then he gets towards the end, try to leave out the parts that the readers tend to skip. And that ties into everything else. But I think one specific angle there is if you don't know better, go top heavy on the dialogue. You don't have to write long paragraphs, no matter, how award-winning you think they might be or how critical to the story you might think they are. They're not generally critical to the story. You have people talk, and you can get to the bottom of a lot of things, and you can tack in here and there when necessary the paragraphs and even the description, and even to an extent the description of the characters, places, and things. But for the most part, try to put yourself in the reader's position. Take a step back. What would they skip? Would they skip the dialogue where people are actually explaining, talking about what's happening, and revealing their personalities, or would they skip where the writer is just droning on with description? So think about that. And Leonard's final rule, it's again kind of a humorous one, but his most important rule that sums them all up is when he goes back through it and he rereads it, if it sounds like writing, he rewrites it. Now, I don't want you to rewrite things. I want you to write a good first draft here and get the book published. That's our key thing. If you start rewriting, you might never make it. I've given examples before of people I've known who've committed themselves to rewriting for years, and they're never going to write that first novel. It's not going to happen. But so take that one with a grain of salt. But the takeaway from that is he doesn't want it to sound manufactured. He wants his work to sound natural. And once it sounds forced, then a little too precise, then the writer sounds a little too full of him or herself. And he rewrites those. But the best thing is don't write that way in the beginning. Keep it natural and simple. And these are 10 rules that you may toss, but you may pay attention to some of them. I think it's worth at least understanding all of them and how they might apply to your work. And then when you read other people's works now, especially in your genre, keep these rules in mind and see if those writers adhere to the rules and when they maybe didn't, and whether it worked or whether it didn't. If they violate any of the rules, see if it worked. These are instructive. Okay.